welcome, and I think we may have some drifting in a little bit later as they finish their breakfast. In case you missed it, it's over there, but stay. We need you in class. I know there are a few others that are planning to join us here. So let me just recap a little bit to bring us up to date. I pointed out a couple of sessions ago in Psalm 48, where the beautiful psalm that says, "Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise in the city of our God, his holy mountain, in its beauty, in its loftiness, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion, the city of a great king. God is in her citadels, her towers, her refuge, her fortresses. He has shown himself to be her fortresses." And then at the end of that 48th Psalm, it says, "Walk about Zion, go around her, count her towers, consider well her ramparts, view her citadels." In other words, look at it, get a good picture in your mind of all that is there in Mount Zion, in order that you may tell of them to the next generation. For this God is our God forever and ever. He will be our guide even unto death. And the assumption is, while it must have been alarming to the people of Jerusalem, that they need to look at all that is existing because it might not always be here. And if this ever gets destroyed, you need to tell your grandchildren what once existed. Or if they're no longer able to come to Jerusalem, you need to be able to tell, if you are in exile, you need to be able to recall what God had done, what he had provided. Now, there's another passage that is related to this, but this one now takes place after the temple is destroyed. And Ezekiel, when he's writing his prophecy and his messages from the Lord, in Ezekiel chapter 43, he says, I saw the glory of God of Israel. An angel came and was showing him what the future would hold. And in that development, in that prophecy, he then says, "Son of man, describe the temple to the people of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their sins. Let them consider the plan, and if they are ashamed of all they have done, make known to them the design of the temple, its arrangements, its exits, its entrances, its whole design, and all the regulations and laws." In other words, now that the children of Israel are no longer in Jerusalem, they've been taken captive by Babylon. They're in Babylon, and the temple has been destroyed. But God is giving Ezekiel a vision of a new temple that someday will be built. But he's reminding Ezekiel to talk to your children, your grandchildren. Let them know what once existed back in Jerusalem, the way it used to be with Solomon's glorious temple, just an amazing construction, and then all of the development on Mount Zion around that temple. But also tell them that God has a plan, and here are the details. And of course, if you read the book of Ezekiel, you get bogged down sometimes where it talks about all the measurements of all the porches and all the rooms and the columns and colonnades and all of that. And it's kind of like, do we need all this? Well, yes, the children of Israel needed that detail. And he says, write these down before them, so that they may be faithful to its design and follow all its regulations. This is the law of the temple. All the surrounding area on top of the mountain will be most holy. Such is the law of the temple, or as some translations say, holiness is the law of the temple. And what the prophecy is giving is both a reflection on past history and on God's future promises. Jesus said, I will build my church. And the church of Jesus Christ is where God will dwell among his people. And he said it will be attacked. It will be under pressure. And that's what we're looking at in this series. What are the pressures that are trying to destroy the church of Jesus Christ? But the parallel is what caused the Temple of Solomon to be destroyed? What was it? It wasn't that Mount Zion, the bedrock, the mountain disappeared. The mountain is still there. You can still see where Herod's temple had sat on top of it, and that's destroyed. The temple in Jesus' time, which was even bigger than Solomon's temple, that's been destroyed. And the prophecy was because of the disobedience of God's people, because they failed to maintain a holiness in their convictions, in their practices, in their lifestyle. They rebelled against God, they disobeyed God, and that which was central to their worship ended up being destroyed. And I would submit to you in this course and in our understanding of Scripture, if we are unfaithful to God, if we say we don't care what God's guidelines are, what his regulations are, we can just live like we want to, however we feel, and everything will be fine. God will overlook all of our disobedience, our rebellion. No, he's promised that his law, the law for his worship, the law for his church, the law for his temple, is holiness, yieldedness to him. Okay, back in February of 1971, some of you weren't even born yet, but that's 50 years ago. My wife and I were living in Southern California in Los Angeles, or in Downey, California, a suburb of LA. This beautiful building was a few miles to the northwest of us. This was the hospital near Sylmar. And we had to go to Kansas for a meeting of conference boards, and we both went, and our two children we left in Downey with friends from our church where I was pastoring, and our son was 1 year old, our daughter was 4 years old. This building looks wonderful. Look at all those windows and all of the structure. Let me show you the next picture. That's the way it looked later in the day on February 9th, 1971. That building is still standing, sort of, but you're not allowed to go into it because this stairwell on the left of the building is no longer attached to the rest of the building. Early that morning, a 6.6 earthquake hit the San Fernando Valley. And it shook this hospital and lots of other buildings and bridges on the freeway, and roads were rippled. The San Gabriel Mountains, under which the epicenter was located, actually, they say it lifted 3 feet and then settled back down. The structure of this hospital, let's go a little bit further. It was still standing, sort of. The foundation was still there. The hospital was no longer on its foundation. It had shifted. And we had a young couple from our church that were in an apartment building not far from here, and they had an air conditioner in the window, and the crib for their newborn baby was under the window, and when it started shaking, the air conditioner was shaken out of the window and fell where the crib had been. but the shaking had moved the crib across the floor, and the air conditioner did not crush the child. Other people were not as fortunate. 24 people were killed that morning. When we got back, it was a different world in Southern California. And next slide would be, that still looks, from the air, looks like a nice hospital. It's no longer usable. In the upper left-hand corner, you see part of the stairwell that had fallen. Off to the right is the other stairwell that had fallen off. But that building was condemned, as many dozens and dozens of buildings had to be. What had happened was we had an earthquake in which everything resting on the ground was moved because the earth moved. And in the rippling of that, and if you've ever gone through an earthquake, we had them several times, smaller ones when we were there. We had hanging, pocket doors between the rooms in our ranch-style house. And you'd hear a little rattling starting, and the doors would rattle, and you could hear it move across the house, and you look up, and you see the chandelier swinging, and you just sort of start counting, how long is this going to be? If it's under 10 seconds, you probably relax. If it gets beyond 10 seconds, there's a lot of damage being done somewhere. And it's a very helpless feeling. The thing that's terrifying is that you have, ever since you learned to walk, you expect whatever you're standing on is going to be solid. You came in the floor, in the hallway this morning through the doors expecting that floor to be solid. You came in here expecting everything to remain stable so you could relax. If your foundation begins to move, if your attachment to the foundation comes loose, you are in trouble. You lose all your confidence, you lose your rootedness. So, to 86. I would submit to you that the earthquake that the church has been experiencing, we can call naturalism. The way naturalism works, if we can advance to the next one, naturalism can be described, and I'm going to have a fair amount of text up here, so if you sat all the way in the back, it's your problem. There's lots of seats up here. So, but naturalism can be described as the belief that only the world of nature, the natural world, is what really exists. All that we can know can be discovered or understood if we just look at what is here. By examining and studying the natural world, we can use our natural senses of eyesight and hearing and taste and smell, unless you get COVID and you can't taste and smell. But you normally can use your senses to evaluate, to test, and to observe. So science is based on looking and observing, conducting experiments, and if we can't see it, we use tools like microscopes or electron microscopes to see what, if our eyes were strong enough, could be seen, but it's still part of the natural world. From a Christian perspective, we would say God's created world. The universe that exists is here because God made it, and it's a world of nature, and enjoy it. It's even if it gets hot and steamy this week, enjoy what God has put in this world, what you can see and touch and feel and taste. And cinnamon rolls this morning were excellent to taste, and that we were using our senses. So naturalism is the idea that if you can't fit it into the natural world, well, it doesn't exist, because everything that does exist is in the natural world. So the next slide, let me just say that this threat against the church is not caused by science, not caused by people looking and examining and testing. Naturalism is going one step further and saying, we can know all of this. We don't need a God to help us understand this. We don't need God telling us what's going on. In fact, because God is not part of our natural world, we don't need God at all. We just assume that what exists is what can be seen, felt, touched, tested, observed. The natural world is all that there is. The Christian says the natural world is wonderful because God made it. God is the one who designed it, produced it, created it, sustains it. So we're not against nature. We're against nature without a God. That is naturalism. Now, this is not a new thing. Some of the things we'll talk about have just developed in the last 20, 30 years. This goes back 200 years, that this has been a pressure on the church. And Dr. Machen, back in the 1920s, 1923, analyzed what was happening when Christianity started believing that naturalism explained everything and we don't need God, that there's no supernatural, something above the natural. All things are natural. There is no supernatural. So there are no miracles, there are no angels, there's no revelation from God. There's no God to speak to us. There's no God that cares about us. So here's what Dr. Machen was saying back in the 1920s, but he was reflecting on what had been going on. The great redemptive religion, which has always been known as Christianity, is battling against a totally diverse type of religious belief, which is only the more destructive of the Christian faith because it makes use of traditional Christian terminology. They keep talking about God and peace and love and truth. They use Christian terminology, but this modern, non-redemptive religion is called modernism or liberalism. Those were the terms that were hitting the church from 1900 on, starting in 1890 really. But in the 1920s, this was the battleground. In all of our denominations, it was an issue. And Machen says, both names, modernism and liberalism, both names are unsatisfactory. There's nothing modern about it. It's an old-fashioned attack from Satan himself for centuries. It's not liberal in the sense that it liberates. Both names are unsatisfactory. The latter in particular is question-begging. The movement is designated as liberalism. It's regarded as liberal only by its friends. Oops, I guess there's a line missing there. But to its opponents, it seems to involve a narrow ignoring of many relevant facts. So don't confuse me with your facts. I've already decided what I don't believe and what I believe. So I'm pretending I'm liberal, but I'm really narrow-minded. And what Machen was saying, don't call yourselves a liberal then. You're not liberal. You're not looking at the whole picture. But then continuing, he says, but manifold as are the forms in which the movement appears, the many varieties of modern liberal religion are rooted in naturalism. That is, in the denial of any entrance of the creative power of God, as distinguished from the ordinary course of nature, in connection with the origin of Christianity. Naturalism doesn't have to have a God. In fact, it doesn't want to be bothered with a God. So one of the reasons I got into this whole thing is I started bumping into some of the teaching that was going on by so-called highly educated people. And I was reading a dictionary of evangelical Christianity, or a dictionary of Christianity, not evangelical, just Christianity in general. And I looked up, what does it say about Mennonites? And it has some good information about our history and background. And then at the end, it said, and a few of the current Mennonite theologians are, and it listed John Howard Yoder and Gordon Kaufman. Now, I had learned about Gordon Kaufman back in the 60s during the God is Dead movement. 1966, Time magazine had a cover, God is Dead, bright red. And it was shaking the churches, for those of you that were around at that time. And oh my goodness, how are we going to deal with this? All these scholars are saying God is dead. Basically, they're saying we don't need God anymore. And they were buying into the outcome. When you start with naturalism, this is where you end up. Well, Gordon Kaufman was teaching at Harvard Divinity School. Yes, he was a Mennonite in background, and he claimed to be a Mennonite, but his beliefs and his description of his faith was anything but Mennonite. Menno Simons would have said, stop calling yourselves by my name because you don't believe anything I believe. But anyway, Gordon Kaufman, when I saw that he was listed as in this dictionary as a Mennonite theologian, I began to get bothered by that and start looking a little bit more. And that led me to some of the studies that have resulted in this seminar. But Gordon Kaufman when I did this originally, he was retired professor emeritus. He's since died, and now he knows better. But anyway, Gordon Kaufman's construction of the concept of God develops in two steps. See, and he kept talking about God, and he kept talking about Jesus. But when you look at what is he saying in his writings and in his teachings, he has changed God. The first step that he took is to analyze how does the concept of God as it has functioned in Christian thinking and praxis, which is a fancy way to say practice, in the West. And then he looks at the second step that he took is to map out the contemporary picture of human existence and the world as it shapes the way people understand the reality and meaning of their lives. So the current view of human existence, he says, and the world, and of human existence and the world, now we know it is shaped by evolutionary and historical perspectives. Now that we know we have evolved and we're not created, now that we know we're simply the highest form of life as far as we describe it, but only because we evolved further than some of our animal relatives, now that we know that that's true, now we have to go back and say, well, how do we talk about this thing we used to call God? And since we have this evolutionary and historical view of the universe and our place within it that recognizes the significant creative activity that occurs within the universe, I mean, look at what people are doing. Look at the wonderful things. Now, one of the things that bothered Kaufman is we actually split the atom, and we've made atom bombs, and we have enough missiles to blow the whole world to smithereens, and so that bothers him. Because in our evolutionary historical development, we've gone the wrong direction. At least from what he would prefer, that the direction he would like to have had us go. And so he talks about, as we look at our history and we know we're evolved, and what we need is a serendipitous creativity. We need to come up and imagine something better than throwing nuclear weapons at each other and destroying the planet. In light of such a view of the cosmos, one needs to reconstruct the concept of God. So that's your job. Come up with a better God than the one you thought we had. He goes on to say, when one takes these two considerations, the twofold function of the concept of God and the evolutionary historical view of the cosmos into account, God, that word, refers not to a particular existent being within or beyond the world, but rather that word God refers to our creativity, this serendipitous creativity. Just think of the things you can imagine. I mean, my goodness, we now have Harry Potter on broomsticks, and we can play games in the air. We can come up with noise and call it music. There's all kinds of things. We are so creative. And so as we have this creativity at work within our evolutionary ecosystem and giving reality and direction to a movement and interconnectedness and the great multiplicity of particular events and beings in the world. And by the way, people used to pay a lot of money to sit under his teaching at Harvard. But what we need to do is come up with a different concept. So God now is what we imagine him to, or it, or her to be. It's up to us to design a God that will meet our needs and help us to keep from destroying this planet and get us on a good serendipitous direction. Now, he'll talk about Jesus and Christ. But when he talks about Christ, Christ is the paradigm, the model, that pattern for both God and humanity. Now, he's not meaning Jesus Christ is God the Son who became truly man, as we believe in Christianity, in Orthodox Christianity, but we now have this idea of Christ links an idea of God, which we used to have, and now our understanding of humanity. The vision of God is normatively determined by our picture of Christ. And similarly, the understanding of what it means to be human and humane is shaped by the view of Christ. Now, he would say that some of what we have in the New Testament, Christ's teaching about love and love your enemies and all that, that should shape our view of how we live in the world. But to say that what we have in the New Testament is exactly true, and because it's inspired by God, the Holy Spirit, no, we only have this idea of Christ because that's what good men imagined and what they wrote down and they created for the benefit of humanity. So while acknowledging the normative role of the concept of Christ within Christian theological thought, Kaufman raises two cautionary points. The first is that the word Christ does not simply and straightforwardly refer to Jesus, but rather refers to a cluster of events surrounding and including this person who was called Jesus of Nazareth. He was sort of an accident of history, but he became a good model, so we created a concept around him. Kaufman is clearly replacing the foundational idea of God as a being with his own mental construct. He is calling for a church to be erected on a different starting point than a God who created the universe, the God of the Bible, the God who has made himself known, the God who came to earth and took on human flesh in God the Son in Jesus Christ. So Kaufman's whole world has shifted from the one foundation that in our faith, not just as Mennonites, but as evangelicals, as Protestants, as Christians, as Orthodox, as Roman Catholics, all Orthodox Christianity is based on a foundation that Jesus Christ is God the Son, who came to be Savior of the world. But that's not where Kaufman ends up. God is what we have thought him to be, and now that we have more problems like climate change and all, we're going to have to rethink God, our concept of God, and reshape him to meet our needs. And if it helps for you to have someone to talk to in prayer, that's fine. Go ahead. You can pray to whatever you're imagining. For those of you that don't want to bother with that, that's fine too, because there's no God out there anyway to hear you. It's just whatever you want to imagine in your mind. That would be fine if he had stayed at Harvard, but he influenced a lot of our churches and a lot of writers and a lot of people that said, I can't understand what he's saying in his book of theology, that he must be brilliant because, I mean, look at all those big words he uses, and, the more confusing you seem to be, the more educated you're assumed to be. But it's the earthquake, this kind of earthquake threat of a theological naturalism that's going to shift not Christ away from being Christ, although that's what Kaufman's trying to do, but it will shift the church off of Jesus Christ to a different Christ, a different God, a different religion, a different faith, or no faith. It undermines the building of a church of Jesus Christ who is God incarnate, God taking on flesh, not a God imagined. So, you might have a beautiful building. It might have cost you a fortune. But when the earthquake of naturalism hits your convictions and beliefs and you eliminate all the supernatural, all the miracles, that's why you have to get rid of a lot of the New Testament, because the New Testament says Jesus was healing the sick and raising the dead and feeding 5,000. And, some of these guys would say, what really happened there in the feeding of 5,000? This little boy said, I have, these loaves and fishes. Other people said, man, if he's that generous, I'll pull out my lunch too, and we'll share all our lunches, and everybody gets fed. And they remove the miracle. Now, I shouldn't have told you that, because every time you hear the feeding of the 5,000, you'll wonder maybe that's how it happened. Just like the people who say, how Jesus walked on the Sea of Galilee. I mean, he was familiar with the area. He knew where the stones were under the water, so he walks out on these submerged stones out to where the fishermen were and scared them half to death. But they thought he was walking on water. Now, wait a minute. The fishermen have been in that Sea of Galilee all their lives working. They knew where rocks were. And then when they say that Jesus is walking on water and they're not close to shore, they're out in the middle, there are no stones for him to step on. So you can't eliminate the supernatural from the record of Scripture unless you reject the Scripture along with rejecting supernatural. So that's the earthquake. Let's go to a second pressure that's on the church today. And we'll do the other, we'll see how far we get today, but we want to get through this one and do the other three next week. The second I would describe as the wind that's blowing. Now, on hot days, you want a breeze. I mean, that breeze is wonderful. Who could object to a little bit of wind? It cools you down. You're going to want it tomorrow. You're going to want it on Tuesday, and especially on Wednesday. That breeze is going to be desired. And the breeze that is blowing in our world today is called tolerance. And what's could be wrong with a bit of tolerance? I mean, after all, much of our history was an intolerant world. And some of your ancestors were burned at the stake because others were not tolerant of their Christian convictions. And they were called heretics. And they didn't agree with some of the authorities in the church. And so William Penn started this colony in order to provide freedom of all faiths would be welcome to come and worship according to their conscience, according to the way they believe the Bible taught, without being persecuted for it. It was going to be a principle of tolerance. And a lot of our ancestors came from the old country because of that. And we welcomed it. And it was a good thing. And it was overdue. So the word tolerance is a good word. But it's changed. It's been redefined. The dictionary meaning, the original meaning, as we would want it to remain, is it's to recognize and respect others' views and beliefs and practices without necessarily agreeing with them or sympathizing with them, but respecting them and saying, okay, you don't agree with what I believe, but I'm not going to burn you at the stake for it. I'm not going to kill you for it. And I don't expect you to kill me for not agreeing with you. We're going to tolerate each other, okay? We recognize there are different beliefs, different practices. Our church practices baptism in one way. Other churches practice baptism another way. And we can fight about it. We can burn down their buildings, or we can tolerate that we have two different ways of baptizing. And we would say we need to tolerate that kind of difference of practice. It's really based on an old word of to put up with, to bear with something. Now, a second use of the word tolerance is, some of you who are farming or in machine work, you know that there's a tolerance when you're putting pistons in the cylinder. You want to have the correct tolerance, the correct measurement between the difference of the one size and the other, that what is allowable as minimum and maximum sizes for your mechanical part to be able to function. It's a basis for determining how accurate is the fitting, or is it going to cause you problems. That we use the word tolerance there. There's a third way that most of us haven't had to use much, but if you work in a bank or if you're working in the Philadelphia Mint, the difference in the amount of silver, when they used to put silver in coins, or gold when they had gold coins, or the amount of nickel, or that what is the tolerance, so that if you take in a bag of pennies and they weigh it, they should be able to tell you how many pennies are in that, because they know how much copper or whatever fake metal they use now, what is the tolerance of the weight, the measure. So how much can you allow a variation of the standard before it is no longer authentic, before it becomes either a fake or you're being cheated or something. So these are the ways tolerance, your grandparents knew what tolerance meant. The original definition is in keeping with biblical understanding. It is necessary for living within a world and of a variety of many people, a variety of many practices. So we're not throwing out tolerance. When you have a voluntary organization, such as a church, you can be pretty exclusive. You can say, well, this is what we believe, this is what we expect, this is our conduct, and if you don't like it, you don't have to join us. We are a voluntary organization, and if you join, we expect you to measure up to certain standards of our society, of our organization. That's necessary if you're going to have a cohesiveness in the group. If you have serious divergence from the group's convictions about truth or morality, well, we just don't tolerate that in our group. We have decided this is what we believe, and if that doesn't suit you, well, we're not going to force you. We're not going to torture you until you believe it. But you need to tolerate our differences. A person is always free to join in the first place or to leave if that group is not in keeping with his own or her own practices, views, or beliefs. That's in a voluntary organization. However, you are a part of groups that it's not voluntary, where you are a member of a group or society involuntarily. Then the toleration of each other's views and practices becomes very important for that group to function. For instance, many of you did not choose to be born in the United States of America. Your parents chose to have you here, if this is where you were born, but that was involuntary on your part. You can't choose all your neighbors unless you're choosing to go into a retirement community, and then you're stuck with whoever moved in next to you. You don't choose necessarily who works in the same factory or for the same company. So a lot of these relationships are involuntary. And your employment, your career, it puts you in contact with people that you might not agree with. They might not agree with you. In these situations, it's important that you bear or forbear with others' beliefs and opinions. Even if you don't agree, that's simply, if you're going to get along and you're not going to be fighting each other, you're going to be able to work together as a team. You're going to, now I know the Phillies are having a hard time deciding what they're supposed to be doing, but they need to forbear and get with it. This is not compromise when we tolerate in this sense of the old-fashioned definition of tolerance. This is good. But this is not what our world is allowing today. That's not the definition of tolerance as your children are being taught on TV, in books, in children's books, in the children's section of the library, or in public schools, and even in private schools. Doesn't necessarily mean you're not bumping into this. In today's postmodern world, to be truly tolerant, you must agree that another person's position is just as valid as your own. In order to be truly tolerant, you must give your approval, your endorsement, your sincere support to their beliefs and their behaviors. See the shift? It used to be we would respect that they have different beliefs, different behaviors, and we're not going to kill them for it. We just think they're wrong. But now you can't think they're wrong. You have to agree that they're right, just as right as you are, even if you don't do those behaviors and you don't agree with all those beliefs, but you have to agree that they are equally as valid as yours. One of the theologians, Grentz, in his primer on postmodernism, says that truth is relative to the community in which a person participates. And since there are many human communities, there are necessarily many different truths. Now, we would say, yeah, we can respect each other, that we're going to have different truths, but this is an outcome or the end result of the postmodern idea that therefore there is no objective truth. Nobody can say this is true for everyone. In a postmodern understanding, truth statements are described by language, the way we speak. I'm telling you what I believe is true. And all language is created in a postmodern way, is created by humans. And therefore all truth is created by humans. Not necessarily individual isolated humans, but humans in a culture, the culture of their respective group. The group constructs the meanings attached to the words that they choose to use. Just as there are many cultures and many languages, so there are many truths. And since truths are created by humans, and all humans are created equal, he's quoting that, but he probably would believe, since we all evolved equally, or as humans, all truth must likewise be equal, at least equally valid. When one uses the word truth, as the postmodern person does, he's not referring to an absolute truth, something that is true for everyone, everywhere. There is a man and a woman. There is a marriage. There is a creator. There is a universe. There is evil. There is righteousness. We need to remember that these things that may be true for you are not true for me. What may be true for them might not be true for you. And vice versa. What is true for you is not necessarily true for them. What is different, however, is that you are expected to agree that their truths are equal to yours. The definition of new tolerance is that every individual's beliefs, values, lifestyle, perceptions of truth, truth claims, they are all equal. There is no hierarchy. There's no more better truth and lesser truth, or good true truth and false truth. Your beliefs and my beliefs are equal. All truth is relative. Now, that should make it easy for us all to get along, right? Can't we expect now that the postmodern will consider that your truths that you believe as an evangelical Christian are equal to theirs? Nope, not quite. For the only thing that cannot be tolerated in a postmodern world is the idea that there is truth that will contradict. So the new toleration, the things that cannot be tolerated by new toleration are those truth claims that contradict the new toleration. If I say this whole idea is off, that cannot be tolerated. This means that all Orthodox, biblically Orthodox, whether Jewish, Christian, Protestant, Catholic, even fundamental Islam who believes the Quran is authoritative, anybody that believes there is a orthodoxy, something that must be believed that is true. We might disagree whether they're right or wrong on some points, but if you believe that there is something true, by definition, something that is a correct opinion, you can't say it's also an equal opinion. Our correct opinions, our orthodoxy, are based on the fact that there's a God who established what's true, what is right by his own creation, by his decrees, by his giving scripture. He has communicated this to humans in a truthful manner. We believe that God can use language and keep language accurate because he designed language. He designed you with the ability to speak. And it was part of the way humans were created. So if somebody says the opposite, we can't say, well, that's equally valuable. Since we have a truthful creator who created language and communicates in languages, we cannot agree with the postmodern premise that we are creating truth by creating meaning in our language, in our subcultures. So we're prevented from playing along with this new tolerance games. And your kids are going to be challenged by some of their friends and some of the teachers and some of the books and programs that they're expected to say that everybody's truths are equal. So we're going to have to quit there. Let me just say that, okay, yeah, we better quit there. We'll pick this up and wrap it up next week.